Good evening. Hi, I'm Cynthia Demise, Project Manager of the new Pride Agenda. Thank you for joining us. We began virtual town halls within 2 weeks of the arrival of COVID. In April, we were hoping to do programming in the community in New York City and then Westchester, Long Island, upstate. But we have pivoted to this way to talk to the community and hear from the community. So we thank you all for your participation. We first focused on COVID, then we went into different issue areas, immigration, Black Lives Matter, Stonewall to our current situation, etc. And tonight we want to talk about criminal justice reform. What will be upcoming starting in September is we will start on September 18th with a upstate focus, focusing on Rochester, Buffalo, and Syracuse, to begin to hear what are upstate issues, what are issues that LGBTQ and their allies care about. And that'll feature Assembly member Harry Bronson and local stakeholders and leaders within the LGBT community, led by our community board member, Victor Sanchez. Two things to get you current. Thank you for so many of you that applied to be an executive director of the new Pride Agenda. We received almost 300 resumes. And so we are in the process of vetting and interviewing, and we hope to we have some wonderful candidates, and make a wonderful suggestion that will take new Pride Agenda to the next level this fall. And one more thank you. Many of you have been partners, LGBT community organizations, on the Columbia New Pride Agenda survey. We have over 1,200 responses. We're meeting with Columbia next week to begin to aggregate that information, including how you feel about different issues and how you feel about electoral process, and does it work to dare to complain, does it matter? And we will use that as informing us in our organizing tool. So thank you for joining us. I look forward to hearing the discussion. I'm always educated by it, and I appreciate it. And now to Ahmed Mohammed from our staff. Thank you.
Thanks, Cynthia, and thank you everyone again for joining us. My name is Ahmed Mohammed, a community organizer with the New Pride Agenda. As Cynthia mentioned, tonight we'll be talking about criminal justice reform. But before we get into a little bit about the topic and dive into the questions, I want to give an opportunity to our lovely panelists to say their name, maybe their pronouns, where they're based, and a little bit about the work that they do. And to just be super political, I'm just going to go alphabetically by last name. So Assemblymember Danny O'Donnell, you're first on the hot seat.
When your name's O'Donnell, you're very rarely first alphabetically. Thank you very much. My name is Danny O'Donnell. I'm a member of the New York State Assembly. In 2002, I became the first openly gay man to be elected to the New York State Assembly, joining Deborah Glick. I wrote and passed the marriage equality bill 5 times. Don't tell the governor, he thinks he did it. I wrote and passed the repeal of 50A just last year. Don't tell Donald Lieberman, because she thinks she did it. And because I was, in my past life, a public defender in Brooklyn during the crack years, I'm acutely aware of policing issues. And when I got to the Assembly, I was very concerned about reforming them. That at that time, it was a very lonely club to be in. And it is not such a lonely club. We in our community have to remember Stonewall was a riot in response to police brutality. That is how, those are our roots. And we share those kind of roots with other communities of struggle. And we can't, just because you get a big job or you feel safe in your doorman high rise does not mean we're not in the crosshairs of the police community. And so I'm happy to join in this. I will try to be as silent as I can unless you need to hear from me. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And then Stanley, do you mind going next?
Yes, absolutely. My name is Stanley Martin. I'm a project director and statewide organizer with the Center for Community Alternatives. We're based in Rochester, New York City, and Syracuse. and we provide direct services to people who are directly impacted, but we also have an advocacy and organizing lens where we want to ensure that we center the voices of directly impacted people when fighting for legislation and criminal justice reform and change. So that's a bit about me, and I will pass it on to Raven.
Hi, everybody. Peace. My name is Reem Ramadan. My pronouns are she, her. I'm the lead organizer at the New York City Anti-Violence Project. A little bit about AVP. AVP is a client services and advocacy organization. We serve to work with and empower LGBTQ survivors of violence. And we're also a voting member of Communities United for Police Reform, where we're doing a lot of our police accountability work and also work to counter and combat hate violence. And I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Thank you all. We're excited to have everyone here and to get this conversation going. So first, I want to talk about 50A, but I want to frame it in the broader discussion of legislative wins and setbacks regarding criminal justice reform. And so if we're first talking about some of the wins, and the repeal effort has been years in the making. And so we know that it's kind of like the political tailwinds and a bunch of different things happening at the same time, like align the stars, if you will. So I want to go to Assemblymember O'Donnell, and if you could just briefly explain 50A and why it needed to be repealed, the statute, and then a little bit about the legislative process before we get into the organizing process behind it.
Okay. 50A of the Civil Rights Law was written in the 1970s in order to ensure that criminal defense lawyers do not get access to personal, with an AL, information about police officers for the purpose of either harassing them or cross-examining them while on the stand. In the 50 years since it was passed, or 45 years since it was passed, the courts have increasingly interpreted it to mean an outright ban on any personnel records of a police officer. And those cases were primarily brought by the PDAs. So somebody would file a FOIL request about certain information. They would go to court and say, no, 50A doesn't allow that. And the courts increasingly ruled that that was correct. And in, I don't know, maybe 3 years ago, the Court of Appeals came down with a horrible ruling that said 50A was an outright blanket covering everything. 5 years ago, was at a public hearing where the Committee on Open Government testified and said, if you want accountability in your government and transparency in your government, you must repeal 50A. And I wrote a little note on my folder saying, what is 50A? Because I didn't even know what it was. And so began my mission to repeal 50A. I wrote a bill to outright repeal it, and I wrote a bill to modify it. In the beginning, it was very lonely. Nobody wanted to get on my bandwagon, and many of my colleagues were afraid of angering the PBA unions because they were contributors to their campaigns. As a person who's never received any money from the PBAs, I wasn't losing very much, but it was really a matter of principle for me to do that. And then slowly but surely, with people who were on this call, a coalition coalesced around it, and it began to build slowly. And the Democrats took back the state Senate, and Senator Bailey, a fabulous co-chair in the Senate, picked up the bill. And he and I got to work closely together to figure out what the strategy should be to make it move. But like most things in life, it wasn't a well-planned, well-oiled machine. Life got in the way. Mm-hmm. What happened was in Minneapolis, there was a murder, Mr. Floyd, I believe his name was, and we all watched with horror the actual murder of an innocent American at the hands of a police officer. But what was different about Minneapolis and Minnesota is they don't have a 50A law at all. And before the end of the week, we knew every single allegation of misconduct that that officer had done in his life. against innocent civilians because they had no 50A. And so here we had a very glaring compare and contrast with what is it like in the state of New York versus what is it like other places. And that, with the wind of a movement of people, is what created it. And I was astounded by the movement. So for those of you who participated in the movement, I've been in a lot of movements in my life. And let me tell you, I had never seen anything like this, where I got 10 times as many letters from voters saying repeal 50A. I went to a rally in Harlem and I was the first speaker because I know the history so well. I've lived it for 5 years. Young, I believe lesbian couple, one was Asian, one was African American, carrying a big sign that said repeal 50A. They were in their 20s. And I was just dumbfounded that it had penetrated into the consciousness in such a way. And I walked up to them, I said, well, why should I repeal 50A? And they knew exactly what it did. I said, well, I'm the guy who wrote the bill, so I'm good. And then strangely, when the bill was debated for 7 hours on the floor of the assembly, the Jonas Brothers and Ariana Grande and Mariah Carey, are tweeting repeal 50A. I'm like, how the hell did that happen? So I don't know about that part of it because I don't know those people and I didn't talk to those people. I was thankful for their support, but in the end, it became clear that 50A was a obstruction to justice and obstruction to rightful information. And the family of Mr. Floyd knew everything they needed to know about who had committed his murder. And Eric Garner's mother didn't know that information.
Right.
And so that's how it happened. That's what it was. And I'm very proud to have thought of it, very proud to have fought to get it done, and very happy with the outcome.
Yes. Well, thank you for sharing. And we definitely applaud your efforts in spearheading that legislatively by co-sponsoring it. It reminded me, there's a good point that you made, but before I ask Stanley and Reem to chime in, I also forgot to ask the audience members to peg us anything that comes to mind, any question in the Q&A function. I'll try to integrate that throughout the conversation. And then if you just have any comments, not questions, we also encourage it to be interactive in the chat box. But you said something about how you were dumbfounded by just the frequency at which people were contacting you about repealing, and how the organizing seemed very broad in its scope. And so I want to pivot to Stanley and ask, why do you think, or can you discuss a little bit about how the organizing for this was overwhelming, and how even the assembly members who were on board felt a different sort of energy regarding it? And then Reem, I'll come to you for a little bit.
Yes, so I think this was a culmination of just years of intentional and active work from organizers and families who had lost their relatives to police violence. I think the important piece in how this was won is the deep-rooted organizing, making sure that the movement included the voices of everyone, including and censoring directly impacted people, but reaching out to the legislators who had the power, reaching out to mainstream icons that we don't know, but have a voice and power within their following, and making sure that the movement was intersectional, making sure that we drew attention to what 50A really means, unpacking the impact of, preventing the public from seeing police misconduct and disciplinary records, and what that looks like when the same officers keep engaging in violence that harms our community. So I think the education and using the voices and stories of people who have lived through the violence of police brutality was very crucial in making this seem like this is something we have to fight for. This is something that needs to be passed now. It was presented as something that wasn't a choice, but something that needed to be done. And as Assemblyman O'Donnell mentioned, people calling, texting, doing all these things, making you feel that if you do not engage in the movement to repeal 50A, you are going to be on the wrong side of history. So I'm glad you were on the right side of history when this happened.
Thank you, Stanley. And then Reem, anything you want to add, but also thinking about how we're sharing the stories of those directly impacted and other strategies such as that, what kind of like organizing lessons come to mind? There's like this famous, not famous, but this like quote about politics or just organizing that I've come across multiple times. It's like people who aren't in the work have like a 30-day memory. And so if you're not every day checking emails and doing conference calls about the topic, it's easy. I don't want to give excuses, but most people can, it's a fleeting thought or a fleeting concern. So are there any lessons, I guess, that we could like take and make sure we could apply to future fights?
Yeah, totally. For sure. And I also want to uplift and echo what Stanley said, that this has been years in the making, and the organizing that has been going on this has been for almost 3 years. And I want to name also that it was totally a coalition effort, and led by Communities United for Police Reform, and also the Safer New York Act coalition of over 100 organizations, of organizers and organizations that are or work closely with folks on the ground, directly impacted communities that experience the harms of policing. And you said it, Ahmed, if you're not like in it every day, like it's the organizing, like what happens in the back end might like slip, but just to name that in those 3 years and all our collective efforts within the coalition of conducting political education workshops, of organizing direct actions, pressuring and talking to elected officials, and to also acknowledge Assemblymember O'Donnell for carrying the bill for such a long time, and also for his overwhelming support and advocacy within the Assembly on this. To also name that, this was years in the making. This was like an accumulation of years of organizing and building relationships, and really pushing for this, and to also name, right, as like we all did, to name the uprising that happened, right, and to also say their names, George Floyd, Tony McDade, and Breonna Taylor. And when this happened, that it became a national movement, and we saw the nation erupt in protest and erupt in direct action. And so it pushed us and sort of gave an opportunity for New York to pass police accountability laws. And on that note, I think the lessons, on the note of the uprising, I think one thing that like we've been talking about and also thinking about, that it shouldn't really take an uprising for us to get to this point, right? We shouldn't really be waiting for a revolt for us to talk about, and for legislature to want to push police accountability laws. And that's definitely one of the major lessons. And then also another one, and y'all mentioned this already too, is what happened with the external politics and the movement that's happening on the ground, people on the streets, and our campaign works, and the alignment that happened across all these different things that also granted us with this opportunity too. And so how do we use this moment to have conversations like this, and to use this momentum also to have more conversations about police accountability and building people power, without there having to be a revolt, and like keeping the conversation going, and like all the conversation has been going within the coalition for decades, that we've been working on police accountability and police reform. And I'll stop there. I feel like I'm going on.
No, that was great. I appreciate that. It reminds me of like some of the other legislative setbacks that we haven't necessarily passed legislature. One that comes to mind most immediately is walking while trans, or repealing walking while trans, the loitering for purpose of prostitution statute. I want to go back to you, Reem, if that's okay. And I want to ask, like, so we saw like the historic march for Black trans lives in Brooklyn a couple weeks ago. And so there is that energy still. Why do you think that the repeal effort has stalled for like the last couple of weeks? And because the 2-year legislative deadline's approaching, what do you think that says for like the repeal effort's future. I'm going to come around and try to poke everyone's brain about this. So.
Totally. Yeah, I think the answer to this is simple as to why it's been stalled, right? I think like where we've been at actually is we have the support of the Senate, we have the support of the Assembly, and I think there's only one block that Andrea Stewart-Cousins has put. So I think the one thing that needs to be done, and also one thing that like I want to encourage everybody that is like tuning into this, is to push and try to get calls and try to do some like social media outreach and like really tag and like put some pressure on Andrea Stewart-Cousins, who is the Senate Majority Leader that has put the block on this bill. And so ultimately we would just need leadership to like put this bill on the Senate floor. And I think we have, you're right, Ahmed, like there's been a large momentum on this and there's been a lot of support on this.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Stanley, do you want to add to that?
Absolutely. And I think within this situation, we see that our leaders are not prioritizing the safety of trans people, specifically Black and Brown trans people, when it comes to their political agendas. We know there is an election coming up, and we do believe that for some reason, this does not seem to be a priority. There's some cognitive dissonance where we see politicians tweeting out Black Trans Lives Matter, but when there's a chance to actually pass strong legislation that protects Black and Brown trans people, they fail to step up to the task. So just like Reem said, making sure we're doing some political organizing, reaching out to Senator Stewart-Cousins, making sure she's aware that her constituents do support repealing the Walking While Trans legislation.
Yeah, thank you. And Assemblymember O'Donnell?
Well,
this is a real hot seat now, I guess.
Yes, it is. This is one of the problems. We as a community elect people to be insiders, and you're outsiders, and you want us to do the insiders' work. And there can be great frustrations. In the repeal of 50A, I was angry at many organizations because they kept on just saying repeal 50A, which was nice, but they didn't include my bill number. Why is that important? Because the greatest ease to get away from actual progress is to do half the job. And I, as an attorney who had practiced criminal law for all those years, knew you couldn't just modify 50A. You had to repeal it. And if they give it half a chance, people might say, well, let's give them a half a loaf. And so the way Albany works is if you wrote the bill, which I did 5 years ago, and you are the sponsor of the bill, which I was, only I can change the words in that bill. And so by just saying repeal 50A, you left a very wide berth for someone to come up with calling it repeal 50A without actually doing the repeal that was necessary to get rid of 50 years of bad court cases. Now, as it applies to Walking While Trans, which I fully support. Again, I do not believe that going after Andrea Stewart-Cousins is the right thing to do. I do not think that will be fruitful. We are not in session because of COVID, and I don't know when we're going back, but I do know that after 18 years of being there, that there's always a window in the last 6 weeks of our 2-year term to get things done. And rather than focusing it on one person, I think it needs to be more about an education campaign to make sure that people understand it. If you had asked me in January, are we repealing 50A this year? I would have said, I don't think so. So in the end, the murder of George Floyd, the pain and suffering of the women who's lost mostly their sons, telling us their story, and the organizing on the ground was very helpful. If I can tell you the number of dinners I've been to regarding marriage equality, where some entity gets up there and says, oh, look what I did. And it's no little bit of frustration that I spent 5 years doing that, and I spent 5 years doing this, and now we're at this moment with Walking While Trans, and it seems that we're going to the strategy of blame rather than the strategy of educate. And, you know, I had to talk to some people who were, you know, telling their people to contact their assembly members and demand that they go on the bill. And that is the wrong strategy. It's the wrong strategy. And so, you know, my favorite line from Downton Abbey is hope is no replacement for strategy. So the strategy now about walking while trans needs to be focused on education and relying upon your allies in the bodies to help participate in that. And lastly, we all can't pass everything, right? So you have to prioritize if you're a legislator. What is more important to me, passing X or passing Y? I made it clear to the leadership in my house, 50A was my top priority this year. They knew that in last December, right? So who are the sponsors of Walking While Trans repeal? And are they giving it significant enough priority to make it go, to make it happen? Or do they want that and 5 other things? So that's the nature of the way a legislative body works. Well, that's the way Albany works. And I would just encourage you to not go to the blame game, go to the education game, and hope that come November, when the world has had some sense of normalcy returned, we can get this done.
Thank you for sharing that. I want to give an opportunity for either Reem or Stanley to perhaps like talk a little bit about like some of the education work that's like been ongoing. I know that there's like a campaign of people like trying to extrapolate what a person of trans experience might get stopped for, and on like a non-trans body, and try to educate in that sense. Do you guys have anything else in that regard that you guys would like to talk about? Some of the organizing that's already happening in that sense?
Yeah, I can just talk briefly to add on to that. And Assemblymember O'Donnell, I'd like to respectfully challenge that and say that like education has been happening around this since the repeal, since the conversation about the repeal started. And education is one of the main pillars of organizing. And so it's this ongoing, as we're pushing legislation, as we're building people power, we're also continuously having conversations and political education workshops with many different audiences. And I think to also, you know, have a both and situation, you know, so we can continue the work on the ground and continue to like build momentum and build education, and to hold the people accountable and to recognize like where is the block here, and to name the people that are holding back the passage of this bill, and to hold them accountable, right? So I think to think about it that way also is a good strategy.
Okay, and I'm not saying that you weren't doing education, but do you know who's responsible to get the majority leader of the Senate to move his bill? The Senate sponsor of the bill. That's whose job it is.
Mm-hmm.
So don't go to Andrea and say it's your fault. It is Brad's job and Brad's obligation to make it a priority. And what we have here is a 2-year cycle where we made major progress on bail reform and discovery and other issues, which has inflamed the opponents to us. And it's a much more politically explosive conversation than it was 8 months ago. And like I said in the beginning, I am not taking credit for this. Mr. Floyd's death propelled 50A to the front of the conversation. I didn't do that. Mm-hmm. And I'm the beneficiary of it because I got to take it and run with it. But in the end, whether a house takes a bill up is a conversation between the sponsor and leadership. Mm-hmm. I passed the bathroom bill this year with 0 no votes. I passed the bill to require PEP and PrEP to be paid for by insurance company. That bill never came to the floor of the Senate either. Yeah. So in the end, I'm not sure why the Senate does what the Senate does. It's often a mystery to me, but I can assure you it is the obligation of the sponsor to move the bill, not the leader. And I reject the idea that she is the block. I reject that. I reject that. And if she is the block, maybe it's because the senator's sponsor has gotten too much from her in the last 2 years. And maybe that's what that is. But I don't know, because I like her very much, but I don't believe she's the block the way you phrase it.
Mm-hmm.
I hear you. And I think when I say hold elected officials accountable, I do mean like whoever is in the process that is has responsibility or has power in moving the bill forward. I totally agree.
Well, but you also need to know, since we left session, I have had 10 of my assembly colleagues call me and say, you have to explain this to me, the walking while trans thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm not blaming you for that either, okay? I'm not saying you're not educating people. I know you are. We wouldn't be having this conversation if you hadn't done that work. But in the end, certainly as it relates to criminal justice and the way words are and the way words are interpreted, having a lawyer in the room who can explain it to non-lawyers to make them more comfortable. And I have been very successful, and that's why I've told all the advocates, I am confident, even though I'm not the sponsor, I am confident in the assembly, we have the votes to pass this.
Mm-hmm. Stanley, did you want to jump in?
Yes, I really wanted to echo Reem's point about accountability and not necessarily pointing fingers. Organizers on the ground do a lot to make sure they do partner with lawyers and people who can help with unpacking some of the jargon that we see in legislation. But I also, you mentioned Assemblymember O'Donnell, your priority was 50A, but I cannot think of anything more important than protecting our trans siblings. We see the murder of trans people across the United States, with only 2 out of the almost 30 being not Black. So it's really, really important to understand the epidemic of violence against trans people and making sure that they are protected. So I do think it's important to think about it using that lens and censoring ways to make sure they are protected at every turn, since they are the most at risk of violence and harm from the police and other people in their community.
I am acutely aware of that. And when I ended the debate on the bill about the bathrooms, which was just 2 weeks ago, I said we have made so much progress in the last 20 years, but we're still ostracized, and all you need to know is that today a Black trans woman will be murdered in America because it happens almost every day. So I'm not suggesting it's not worthy of it. I'm suggesting to you that the only people empowered to do that are the sponsors. I cannot go into the speaker and say, I want this bill moved. I cannot do that.
Mm-hmm.
It is not my bill.
So I think the takeaway is to, from a legislative perspective, we need to apply pressure to both Andrew Stewart-Cousins and Brad Hoylman. Hoylman's the sponsor, so just to make sure that he is making sure that he's living by that being a priority. And then also that the organizing and educating has been ongoing, and that it is on the ground, and that the nature of this is going to be a little bit of tension and friction, because it's about like having these truthful, sometimes uncomfortable conversations, but I think they're important and necessary. And so I thank you guys for being willing to engage in that back and forth in a really respectful manner. Stanley, you mentioned something that I kind of want to talk about, which is the epidemic that is the murder of Black and brown trans women across the United States. And so this isn't tied to any piece of legislation, but just in a general sense, I want to ask, how can we, sometimes these deaths happen by members of the community. Sometimes it's when they come into contact with institutions such as prisons or jails. And so I guess if we're focusing on the former and protecting them from within the community, what are ways that we can actually start talking about making sure people who think they're good people are also fighting for the most marginalized among us, that being Black trans women at this moment?
Absolutely. I think it's always important to ensure that trans voices are in leadership roles, and knowing that they have the power and the understanding and the lived experience as experts in their own existence to tell us what is needed and how we can support them. I'm not a trans person, so I struggle to even give that recommendation. But generally, I think censoring trans voices is one. Making sure our legislation is grounded in how we can protect and ensure that trans people have equal access, equal rights, equal opportunity to just, exist and live. And I think just making sure we just continue to censor their voices, making sure we uplift legislation like Walking While Trans that protects trans people in our community, and making sure we resist the urge to erase trans voices from our movements, like Assemblyman O'Donnell mentioned, the Stonewall riots where really one of the most important movements that were started and led by trans women. And I don't feel like even within our education system, we censor their voices and their experiences and learn about how they were calling for police accountability then when they were the most at risk of police violence. So always remembering to censor their voices and learn about how they fought for all of us. Even at the forefront of the Black Lives Matter movement, we see trans people leading and fighting for everyone. So we need to, keep that same energy and fight for them just like they do for us.
100%. Reem, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for that, Stanley, and Ahmed. Thank you for this question. Also, I think to name, as y'all have been saying, like there has been way too many incidents of this, and I've also have seen way too many conversations about this labeling it of hate crime. And I think a thing that like we are trying to have more conversations with a vast variety of folks, community, media, elected officials, right, to like really talk about the distinction of hate crime and hate violence and how we can address hate violence that happens in our communities, and particularly for Black trans women. And I think thinking of it as, crime is what is prosecuted by law, and realizing that violence is systemic harm. And violence can happen whether or not if it is a crime that can be prosecuted. It's bias related violence, and that's something that we need to name. And if we can start to have that conversation and to really start thinking of it as addressing hate violence, it will also give us a way that we can start thinking of addressing the root causes of hate violence. And I think one major thing also is investing in, Ahmed, you like brought this up earlier, is like rethinking community safety and stuff like that. Is to also, I want to come back to that point and say that we need to invest in social services and invest in a social safety net that meets people's deeper needs, right? And it's and being able to have that be effective in preventing violence. And it's little things, that like it's the most basic human rights, like housing, like food, like education, like mental health services, and like AVP is doing this work also with the NYC Against Hate, which is a coalition of about 9 organizations, and serving very different communities, and all our organizations sort of having like a to expand our work of offering community methods of safety that is not reliant on law enforcement. And to also bring this back to the work that we're doing with Communities United for Police Reform with the NYC Budget Justice Campaign and the Defund NYPD fight, is that when we asked to defund NYPD, and I'm naming this here, right? So like our community is like a big source of violence, is harmed by police. And I'm naming this here is because when we said defund NYPD, we weren't just saying defund NYPD, we were also saying invest in social services, reallocate that money into social services so that it can really address communities' needs. And this is all, all to say that we need to really find the root causes of what is causing violence, what is causing these incidents of hate, and how can we address them in a way that is embedded in community, that is led by community for community, to really, make systemic change. Because like as I said earlier, it's a lot more than just a hate crime. This is systemic, and like Stanley, you named it as well, right? So how can we battle that both on the community level, and then also having conversations with elected officials, with folks that are signing bills, right? Folks that are deciding on the city budget, the moral document, and just rethinking what safety is and where we need to invest our city money and our energy and our organizing.
That's an amazing point. I was wanting to get into the conversation about what rethinking safety and accountability in our communities look like. And I think it's a good time to, this is a question for anyone who feels compelled to answer, hopefully more than one would like to chime in. But how do we think of ways where like we can hold people in our community accountable and like actually engender a community where people feel like their neighbors they care for one another and there's empathy without the third party police carceral state being like the enforcing mechanism? Is there a way we can, I know there's a way, but just to like keep it more open-minded, what are ways in which we can start thinking about whether it's funding particular social services? I know a lot of people who would benefit who are listening from like a little bit more around the discussion of rethinking this, like the normative of what ought to be around the community and rethinking that. Anyone? Don't jump on at the same time, please.
I can do that a little bit. I want to praise AVP and the work of AVP. You're too young to know what it was like then, but AVP in its inception had a lot to do with direct violence against people in the community. When I got elected in 2003, they came to me because there was a problem with domestic violence in the LGBT community. And domestic violence, the paradigm of domestic violence had been the male is the perpetrator and the female is the victim. And so what do domestic violence professionals do when the couple is a same-sex couple? They didn't know what to do. And so it was the Anti-Violence Project that came up with a training and a work, and they went all across the state in order to move the conversation about DV out of stereotypical gender roles. And I was the person who ensured that that money was in the state budget. When you talk about how do you ensure, or how do you make it better so that the solution is not often involving the police department, my office is preparing an op-ed about all the organizations when I was a public defender that did fabulous work with people who got caught up in the criminal justice system to keep them out of it. Their Friends of Island Academy is an extraordinary organization with young people who get to Rikers, and they work with them when they're there and then when they're on the street to keep them from coming back to Rikers Island. And that started because the people who ran that was then the high school on Rikers, learned that most of those young men and some women were there for 3 or 4 days, and then they went out to the community. And so in the end, we've learned a lot in 40 years, and there are certain kinds of organizations which do great work in ensuring that our paradigm is not just lock them up and throw away the key, and acknowledges the strength and power of what is primarily Black and brown youth and what roles they can play constructively in our society. And so we have every year, there's a fight about whether or not those organizations get funded. And so in the end, that is the solution I'm proposing because of my knowledge of the criminal justice experience. I was, for 4 years, chair of the Corrections Committee in Albany. I visited 38 state prisons over 4 years, and they're far away. But the first question I asked every superintendent, do you have any trans people here under your care? And if they did, they brought me to them first. And I would ask them, how is it here? Do you need anything? I would give them my card. In all steps of life, trans people have a harder path than anyone. And we need to acknowledge that and help them walk a path that allows them to stay healthy.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for sharing that. it sadly reminds me of the young lady in Polanco who was killed in police custody or died in police custody while she was under police custody. And it started from like a simple altercation, like with a taxi driver. And so this is a question for Stanley, if you don't mind answering. We know that she was in solitary confinement and that her story isn't unique to her, and that countless officers, whether they mean to or not, will come across somebody of trans experience, and whether they think they're doing it for the benefit of the individual or if they're actually malintended, putting them in precarious situations that will unfortunately lead to death sometimes. So how do we demand specifically like that this doesn't happen? And then what like aspirationally can we also be thinking about?
Right. I think systemically we need to understand when Black people or trans people have an encounter with the police, essentially their life is at risk. And then when you have that intersection of a Black or brown trans person, they are in a higher risk situation. So knowing that, I think we should use our social services, people who are mental health counselors, people who are natural leaders within their communities, and allocate resources to them to come in and solve problems. When people call the police for help, they're not calling the police because they want the police there. They're calling because they need help. So we need to rethink public safety to frame it as actual trained helpers and not violence workers, which I identify the police as, are coming in and providing that service that's being called for. In so many different situations that escalate to police presence, I do feel that there are people who are just way more trained, way more equipped, people who are peer mentors, people who have relationships with certain members of the community. If they are paid and funding is allocated to them to actually be the service providers in these situations, it would address a lot of the harm that the police are given space to cause. Systemically, I think we just need to restructure our whole public safety system. I do think we need to abolish the police. I know that's not going to happen overnight, but while that happens and while there's a movement to defund the police, we must replace them with people who are trained counselors and mental health workers and peers in the community and natural leaders in the community to be present to provide support and assistance.
Yes, thank you. Reem, would you like to add to that?
No, just second the importance of redefining public safety and finding community methods and, removing reliance from NYPD. It's like Stanley hit it right on the nail. I think that was dope.
Yeah, cool. And Assemblymember O'Donnell, I'm going to come back to you. There's a question from the audience who love to hear comments on like the next sort of legislative packages that you foresee happening. Like what are the inside game whispers telling you in Albany that we should keep an eye on?
Okay. So here's a little factoid, which I did not know until recently, and that is that there is either a court ruling that says that the CCRB is an arm of the police department. Now it's not, it's a separate agency. That it was considered an arm of the department was part of the problem with getting access to records via 50A. So that is something that we have to look at. We also have to look at the disciplinary processes that are used for police officers. So for example, if you're a New York State corrections officer and you're accused of malfeasance, your hearing is held publicly with a record and a transcript, and the people who want to know about it can watch it. So rather than having it all internal, we could make it so that the Office of Trials and Hearings and Trials and Review, OATH, anyway, it's where most city employees have disciplinary hearings, and therefore it's removed from the control of the direct supervision of police departments. Those are all things that we could consider to begin to look at. As to some of the issues raised previously, in smaller communities, a phone call to 911 often results in a team going out, social workers, mental health providers, psychiatrists, to try, if they can, to diffuse whatever the situation is. Obviously, that's much harder to do in the city of New York, which is so large, but that's a better model for how we deal with crises. And Lord knows, with COVID, mental health issues are going up every single day. And, you know, sadly, a friend of mine who was a survivor of childhood sex abuse recently killed himself. And he was not an unsuccessful human being. He was not alone, and he wasn't, but, you know, he was inherently damaged and from what had happened to him as a child, and what is going on now overwhelmed him. And so, you know, we need all to be cognizant of the struggles that all of our community are in, and we need to find better solutions than the police state. And I'm very distressed as a human being to see military-grade weapons and tanks and all that stuff being used on our people here in America. That's not what that's for. So there's a lot of places where we can go to do that. I, for example, have dealt with the governor a lot, by which I mean I send him letters and he ignores me, but I send him letters. So when some state passes a law that's anti-trans, I send him a letter and say, you know, we should ban state travel to that. And that has happened, the bans have taken place, but it sort of puts the country on notice that we're not leaving our trans brothers and sisters behind, although I would be really happy if a trans brother or sister were to join me in the assembly and I could let them lead the charge of explaining what their life experiences are like.
And hopefully in the near future, we'll have a person of trans experience in the legislature and in city council, and at all levels of government, because we need to hear their perspectives. Reem, I want to come back to you and just sort of the same similar forward-looking question. What are like things that you have your eye on? And they don't have to be legislative pieces, or they can, but just things that you're looking forward to moving and organizing around in the next couple of months leading into the new year.
Sure. I think they're mostly the things that I spoke about already, so I don't want to take up too much time. But really, going into this work that we're doing, both within CPR, where we're with our NYC Budget Justice campaign, and also with NYC Against Hate, and really develop more programs and more opportunities within community-based organizations that can protect and work with vulnerable communities without relying on law enforcement. I think that's really like the work that has been going, as Assemblymember O'Donnell mentioned, since the inception of AVP, and to continue moving that work forward.
Awesome, thank you. And then Stanley, the same question.
So I definitely want to see halt solitary confinement pass. It's been just a huge issue, and the amount of people that it impacts and the lifelong, you know, trauma and pain and suffering that comes as a result of it is just very intense within the community. We see young people who experience solitary and they're not the same after, and our community does not have the resources to provide the healing and restoration when people come out of prisons and jails who have experienced solitary confinement. So that's a huge one I think we should all rally around. It's an issue that impacts, disproportionately impacts Black and Brown people who are incarcerated, and we also know it impacts trans people who are incarcerated. So it's a really huge thing we want to focus on.
Awesome, thank you, Stanley. And
if I jump in here for just 1 second, I also have my own ban solitary bill. I wrote it before HALT was written, when I was corrections chair, and it was based on the United Nations report that said that our use of solitary violated their rules against torture. I believe that HALT, as written, is a problematic bill to get passed. I don't believe the governor will ever sign it. I have voted for it, but I don't believe it's a well-drafted piece of legislation. And so the fixation that the only solution to solitary is halt is troubling to me, because 5 years ago, I think I had a chance to pass this bill, which would have effectively ended solitary in the state of New York. But the advocates insisted that we had to have halt. And now we sit here in 2021 soon, and we still don't have any modification to solitary, and it's a shame.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm about to share this for you, Reem. It's New York Against Hate platform. I just shared a little bit about HALT before you said that, Danny. And so I'll let, hopefully people in the audience can put on their research hat and learn a little bit more about HALT and like other pieces of legislation. And then also the New York City Against Hate platform. We kind of like sped through this. I kind of lost track of time. And so I want to give everyone an opportunity. You don't have to share final thoughts, but before I bring Cynthia back on to like wish us a good night. And I know Reem and I haven't eaten yet, so we're going to eat dinner after this. So any final thoughts anyone has that they want to share?
Just thank you all for being on this panel, thinking about these things critically, each and every one of you on this call. Thanks for the work you all do, and I'm very glad to be in the struggle with all of you.
Awesome. Thank you. Right back at you.
Likewise, also just major thank you, Stanley, to hear. It was so powerful and helpful for me, and I always learn more. And Assemblymember O'Donnell, to thank you again for engaging in this conversation with us and uplifting the work. And Ahmed, thank you for reaching out to us and having us all be here.
Of course.
Thank you for having me. It's lovely to be with such attractive young people, of which I'm neither. And I'm turning 60 this year. My husband already turned 60. I can't really put my head around that. I have been in this struggle my entire life. I spent my entire career primarily representing poor Black and brown people. And that is what drove me to being elected. Albany is not a place that you can say you should emulate, but it is a place that has its own genre and its own culture. And it's incumbent upon our community to have people who get there who can figure that out. And it's also incumbent upon the activists and the advocates to listen to us and guide us in how to do that. Because spending all our time trying to pass bills which may never get passed is not helping anyone. I'm here to help. And that's all the work that I've done. And you know, criminal justice reform has been my life and it will continue to be my life. And I thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak freely in a casual pink shirt on a hot August afternoon.
Well, thank you all. I appreciate it. And I'm not going to take too much time, but this has been super helpful. And even like at times, although a bit not uncomfortable, but just unabashed, we weren't shy about our feelings and how we felt. And so I think that's the best way to have these sort of difficult conversations. And so again, I want to thank you guys for engaging it in such a thoughtful way. CD, do you want to sign us off?
Yes. Reem Stanley, thank you. Thank you, Ahmed. Happy almost birthday, Danny.
Thank you.
Happy almost birthday. I think in this in the very short edge or crease, crevice, that bandwidth between the energy of movement, and there's enormous energy in 2020, and the understanding of how legislation is passed, that combo of the outside and inside game is where we at New Pride Agenda, on behalf of transgender, non-conforming, non-binary communities, people that have less resources, is exactly where we want to be and where we want to push. So I heard very carefully what was being said. We will continue our advocacy regarding walking while trans, solitary confinement, understanding Albany deeply. I've been a lobbyist for many years before I left the field and worked on this new advocacy effort. I think I understand a lot of what was being said, And I will assure you that we will apply with our colleagues whatever efforts we can to continue and advance criminal justice reform. And that means when you come back in the short term, before November, and also, as the Assembly member said, there's also, I know this well as a former lobbyist, you know, after the election in November, there are still opportunities before the session ends with things like walking while trans before you have to start the process again. I've seen enormous amount of legislation being done the very, very end of legislative sessions. So we cannot give up our advocacy, our hope, and we continue to learn from you about how to think about things differently and deeply, and not count on just one piece of legislation, and understand the nuances of legislation, as said by Danny. And so our effort is to try to ride and help create the energy of this movement, advance it, and move it with purpose, with results. We are very results oriented. One more comment. We've created a email list of about 65,000 New York City LGBT voters. That is before we develop the same kind of outreach and ability for a field operation in Westchester and Long Island and upstate. The next focus of our next few town halls will be in two areas. One, regarding understanding better upstate issues, starting with Rochester on September 18th. And also, we're going to have a couple virtual town halls on the electoral process prior to the November election. We want to feature in New York State who are rising stars that are LGBTQ, whether they're district leaders or have one office, etc. How do we promote that, apropos of your earlier comments around trans and other members of our community? And then a second virtual town hall focusing on the federal election, our favorite topic. So we will continue to learn, to educate, and to try to work with our LGBTQ colleagues and friends in the legislature to move the ball on behalf of people we're representing. Thank you so much for this continued education, and have a nice end of August and stay safe. And we hope to see you again soon in September. Okay.
Bye, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you.